It's pointless. It just feels like the writers are trying to show off that they learned about history. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to episode 29 of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host, KiramidHead, and tonight I am going solo once again, and I will be covering a very early draft of the Americanized Death Note adaptation, which has been kicking around for quite a while now. And this draft is dated 2009, and I believe it's one of the very earliest versions. And it's just now coming out later this month, in fact, on the 25th of August, 2017. And I didn't want to wait quite that long to record this to get that thing watched, so I'm going to be doing this ahead of time. Before I get going on, the summation and all that for this episode, I wanted to give a quick mention of my various social media pages. Screenplay Archaeology on Facebook, Screenplay Archaeology on Tumblr, and also on Blogspot. And it's Script Archaeology on Twitter, because stupid character limit even in the name for whatever reason. I didn't like it being called Screenplay Arch anymore, so I figured, Script Archaeology is a decent enough sort of compromise between those different things. The script I'm going to be bringing to you tonight is, well, like I said, it's a very, very early draft of the American Death Note adaptation, and it's dated from April of 2009, and it's written by Charlie and Velaspar Lapanides. And the basic summation of it is that it follows college student Luke Murray, who is living in Queens with his police captain father, and he's balancing a life with class and work, and he has a girlfriend and all this other stuff going on, and taking care of his sister now that his mother has been deceased for a while. And one night while visiting her grave, he finds in the cemetery this mysterious black notebook with the term Death Note on the front cover. And he takes it home and he looks at it. It has this list of rules in the front about how it can be used, and the fact that anyone whose name is written in it will die. And at first he doesn't believe it, but then he starts testing it out, and the more he tests it out, the more it just confirms to him the power of this thing. And so he decides to use it at first to track down the people who were responsible for the death of his mother, who was killed in a botched grocery store robbery. But eventually he just starts leading a crusade against all crime, which doesn't work in this script. Like, that's what happens in the original anime. It's just a crusade against crime in general, but it doesn't really work the way the script is set up, and I'll get to that later. But eventually, the fact that all of these guys are dying in roughly the same way, in exactly the same way, gets picked up on by the police, and they bring in this mysterious, secretive FBI special crimes profiler, L, who never appears in person to them, at least for a while, to help track down this killer who ends up being named Kira because of an email Luke sends into the New York Times. Now, to get into sort of my background with Death Note, I watched the anime a good long time ago. I've watched through it twice, actually, and I own the DVDs. It's been a while since I've watched through it, but I remember enough of basically what it was like and the basic plot arc of it that I can kind of talk about this thing and how it relates to that in a fairly intelligent manner, because it doesn't really follow the original story all that well. Now, I can say I've never read the manga, but I gotta give credit to Sugumi Oba and Takeshi Obata just for bringing to life this incredibly unique concept for the first time, and it got beautifully translated to an anime, which I thought was really good. And what I just loved about the story was just the kind of odd sensibility of it. I mean, you have Light Yagami, as he's called in that version, who is just this complete overachiever, incredibly normal person, almost insanely normal, who just is bored with his situation. He finds this notebook, and it kind of awakens this sort of psychopathic side to him, which granted is a little fast, but it is an interesting idea, and that he wants to remake a better world from this world. And then he comes into conflict with this antisocial, candy-munching detective named L, and the various mind games they play trying to track each other down, I thought was really cool. And it even got to a point where he's helping L track him down, but he doesn't know he's helping L track him down, and it ends up being part of his larger plan. And just these weird characters like his stalker fangirl, essentially, Misa Amane, who's just obsessed with him, but he has absolutely no time for her because he's effectively asexual and is just completely obsessed with his goal. And, you know, you have the Shinigami Ryuk, who owns the Death Note, who just dropped it down to Earth just because he wanted to see what would happen. And so he hangs out talking to Light and just sort of observing things. And I thought he was an interesting character in the sense he's probably the funniest character in the show, in the sense that he has all these kinds of just weird attitudes. Like, he likes hanging around playing video games and eating apples and stuff. Like, it's almost like he's just having fun while all this crazy stuff is going on. So in the sense, he's kind of like the audience. But yeah, it's a really good show with a lot of twists and turns. I know a lot of people didn't like, it's not the second half really as it often gets described. It's really like the last third, because it shifts between the conflict between Light, or Kira as his, you know, alias is, between Kira and L, and then it shifts to L's proteges, Near and Mello. And while I do think it's not as good as that first section, I still think it works pretty well and was still pretty entertaining and had like some really crazy shit in it, like dumping money over a crowd to cover an escape. And it had a really strong ending, I thought. But yeah, overall, I thought the anime was actually really good and had just tons and tons of twists and turns, which you could never completely translate into a film, obviously. But I did enjoy it. The live action film adaptations, which I believe were more directly drawn from the manga and they were based on the manga, not the anime, but they came out at the same time as the anime, I think, roughly. And I think they're okay. The first one, I think, gets way too exposition heavy in explaining all the little rules of the Death Note, and you could have maybe trimmed some of that down. But it was pretty decent for a setup movie. And the second film, Death Note, The Last Name, had some good stuff in it, but there was like some side stories in it I didn't necessarily care for, like the internal politics at the news station, and some of the changes were a little but the ending was actually fairly interesting. And the double cross L pulls in the ending of that version I thought was actually a fairly decent change to the story and worked for that movie. The L spin-off, L Changed the World, which is directed by Hideo Nakata. The first two were directed by Shisuke Kaneko, and they're not his best work by any means, but they're fine. I mean, they're no Gamera trilogy. But I mean, L Changed the World is Hideo Nakata, who has only made one really superlative film, and that was the first Ringu. Dark Water was pretty good as well, but nothing else he's made has ever measured up to Ringu or Dark Water, really. I just remember thinking L Changed the World was like almost spoofing the whole character of L, which I thought was odd. Like, cause there's this whole thing throughout the franchise where he just walks bent over. He has like this weird bent over posture, and so they have to throw in the scene where he straightens his back and goes like running, and it looks like he's running with a stick up his butt. And it's like an action movie where he's trying to stop like a virus from being unleashed, and I'm like, why does this have the plot of like a direct-to-video 90s action movie? That's not exactly what the L character is about. And then the ending is this weird, because it takes place like between scenes of the second Death Note movie. So he's like, so like that's how it like ties in. And so it ends with him kind of walking off into the sunset while a Lenny Kravitz song plays. And I'm like, what is going on here? Very bizarre film. And there was a new one came out just last year called Light Up the New World, which I never actually sat down and watched, but maybe it's okay. Now, as for the new American film that's going to premiere on Netflix later this month, I've seen some of the clips and stuff. I think it looks interesting. Willem Dafoe as Ryuk is really damn good casting, and I'm kind of interested in the idea of Ryuk being a little bit more malicious than he was in the original, because in the original he's this very neutral character who's just kind of letting Light sort of figure his own way out. In this version, he seems to be kind of goading him a bit and trying to push things in a certain direction, which I think could potentially be interesting as long as they don't go too crazy with it. And it looks like it might be good. I mean, there's not really a whole lot in these clips to really go by. It seems like they got the premise down okay. But I mean, it's directed by Adam Wingard, who's a director I run kind of hot and cold on because I absolutely love The Guest. I haven't seen You're Next, but everything I hear about it sounds kind of bad. And Blair Witch is a film which I gave it a positive review when it came out. I don't think I'd be quite that nice to it now if I went back and watched it again, but I basically remember thinking the first 2/3 of that were kind of standard, like they weren't great, they were okay, but that the third act was really crazy and kind of entertaining. But I don't know what I'd think about if I went back and watched it again. I really don't. So yeah, there's that. And I've not seen any of the other stuff he's done because I really don't give a shit about the VHS movies. I never cared to watch those because watching a horror anthology is always a crapshoot because you'll either get a movie that's really shitty or half shitty or like a third shitty. It's really rare that you find like a really solid, across the board solid horror anthology movie. And especially, and like, any and stuff like the ABCs of Death, which I think he also contributed to. And I'm like, that's 26 fucking segments. Like, that's gonna have an even higher percentage of shit if you go by, the usual algorithms. What the hell am I talking about? But I'm willing to give Death Note a shot because it sounds like he's fairly invested in the project, because I mean, he had it at Warner Brothers and then Warner Brothers let go and he went and shopped it around, and that's how it ended up at Netflix. So I'm curious to see how it turns out. I mean, it could be crap, and I could end up being one of the 15 people who actually likes the movie, like I was with Ghost in the Shell back in March. So who knows? Now, to get a little more into the script, it's written by Charlie and Vlas Parlapanides, who haven't written a whole lot. The main thing that they're known for writing is Immortals, which was a very just forgettable, not very interesting Greek mythology action movie that's trying to be 300 without the machismo or just the sheer insanity to back it up. And Henry Cavill, I like him as Superman, but dear Lord, is he just the blandest of the bland in Immortals. And he's a hero who gets his big heroic speech at the end. And it's all about how crap he is. And it's like, yeah, you really are crap. Really, the only reason to watch that movie is for Mickey Rourke, who is just insane and awesome in it and just really giving it his all, even if his character sucks, because he's given two completely contradictory motivations over the course of the film. And then you just have this shitty, ambiguous ending. It's like, what the hell is that? And the action scenes aren't long enough or good enough to really make it worth watching for that. It was just really lame. And it seems like Tarsum Singh only had one good movie directing wise in him, and that was The Fall. The rest, but whatever. And the other stuff they've been attached to, like I know Vlas wrote and directed, like a romantic comedy. I forget what it's called. And they also wrote like Untitled Military Thriller and like something else, but those two aren't out yet. So they might not even come out. So yeah, I'm not huge fans of these guys, and going off of this script, that doesn't really change. Now, I should mention before I get into the nitty gritty of this that there has been some dispute online as to whether this thing is real or not, and I figured I might as well just throw that out there just to be safe, because you never can tell. I think there's a good chance that it is real, because I remember when Shane Black, and I'll talk about him later, was attached to this. He said he looked at one of the previous scripts before he got involved and mentioned certain things that sounded very similar to what this is doing. So I think it's a good chance that this is the script he saw, or it was a very similar iteration of this script. Now, this thing, to start out with, I don't know how much detail I'm going to go into in this thing, because really, there's not much to it. Basically, what this does is it adapts maybe about 10, 12 episodes of the anime, kind of. And it feels like it's going to set up for a sequel by the end, but then it just doesn't. So I don't know where to begin with this. So yeah, I'm just going to go point by point through the plot. Is that it opens in a way that really weirdly reminded me of Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man, because it opens in Queens and you have Luke Murray getting out of bed, falling down the stairs, running back up the stairs to get something, and then going out and then missing his train. Just reminds me of shit that like Peter Parker in that movie would do, where he'd be like running up and down the stairs and then missing his bus. And I don't like this in movies where they try and make it look like the guy missing his train or his bus because he's late is like makes him such a put upon victim. Because if you really think about it, it's their own damn fault they missed the transport. If they wouldn't have left late, or if they wouldn't have fucked around on the sidewalk and not paid attention, cough, cough, Peter Parker, they would have got on the damn bus, but okay. And then you get this scene, which I'm going to talk about all the things that relate to this throughout the script, because it really doesn't go much of anywhere, is that he sees this woman get shoved onto the train tracks, and he jumps down there to save her, and an express train comes roaring towards them, and so he kind of like pushes her down into a trench and lets the train go over them. Now, I'm no expert on subways, but I'm pretty sure there is no trench directly beneath the train. Maybe in between the tracks or slightly underneath the platform, there would be some space there. But yeah, I'm no expert, but I don't think that's how they work. But okay, so what comes from this is that he saves this woman, and then he ends up getting a medal from the mayor, and there's this whole thing about how his girlfriend got him an orange shirt, and it's ridiculous. And then later on, this woman recognizes him and says, "Oh, you're that hero kid." And he was like, "Oh, no, I'm not." And it really doesn't go anywhere. It's not much of anything at all. which is just bizarre to me that would be a plot point in this thing. And I guess it's part of the reason why a lot of people don't really seem to suspect Luke of being Kira, is because they don't think that this hero kid would do this. But at the same time, it's kind of like, it doesn't serve a purpose in the plot. And also, I should mention, his name here is Luke Murray. And as much as I'm not a fan of this script, and I think the new movie looks interesting, I'll give it this much over that. In that, at least, he's not just randomly called Light, which makes no sense for a white kid from America to be called that, if that makes any sense. But okay, so after saving the woman, Luke makes it to his college class late. In fact, he misses his class. He gets a very stereotypical lecture from a professor, which once again reminds me of the Raimi Spider-Man films with the fucking guy who was being set up to be the Lizard, going, "Oh, I'm going to fail you, Peter." Blah, 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 that sort of thing. And this guy keeps coming back for no reason to give really on-the-nose lectures about the nature of justice and what it means to take justice into your own hands. And it really adds up to not much. It's like, we're stating the theme in big, bold letters. That's all it is. And so Luke meets up with his girlfriend, and he gives her the thing he went to get out of his room, which is his mother's special ring, which is basically him proposing to her without actually proposing to her. And her name is Sophia. And she's in this really for not much of any reason at all. She just kind of comes back later. Like, she's in and out of it. She basically is just there to go, "Hey, Luke, you're acting weird throughout this whole thing." And so, yeah, they talk for a while, and then he says, "Oh, I can't make it because I got called into work tonight." And he works at the South Street Seaport, which just makes me wonder, can he look out his window when he's working and see Will Smith sitting on the dock with his dog and be like, "Yeah, this guy thinks the world's ended. He's crazy, isn't he?" Bad joke, I know. But he works there packing fish, and apparently it pays well. And so when he gets off work, he goes to visit his mother's grave. And as he's leaving the cemetery, he feels this weird sensation of being watched. And before that, there's a bit where he sees some crackheads, which is just kind of, why is that there? And he's like, spins around, looks around, and he sees next to a fallen over tree and a pulverized tombstone, the Death Note. And I actually kind of like this moment because I like the idea of finding it in a cemetery, this thing that causes death in a place of death. I think that's kind of a neat sort of thematic connection, if you can call it that. I like the idea that it fell from heaven, and it fell, well, not heaven, wherever it fell from, and it hit with such a force that it knocked over a tree and broke a tombstone. I think that's actually kind of a neat idea. And so he's intrigued by it. He picks it up, he takes it home, and he sees on the news that there's this hostage situation going on, which is being instigated by this registered sex offender. And they love in this script to bring up the fact that the criminals he goes after are sex offenders and rapists. They're never just murderers. Well, sometimes they are. They're never just robbers or murderers, except for when they are. They also have to be a rapist or a sex offender or a child molester or something. It's really awkward how that keeps getting shoehorned in there. And so he sees it on the news, writes the guy's name in the notebook, keeping in mind the rules that you have to have one of the rules is that you have to picture their face in your head while you write it down. And of course they show this picture on the newscast, and he turns it off right before it gets confirmed that the guy has died of a heart attack, because that's how the people whose names are written in the notebook die if you don't specify any other cause of death. Then it has to be a physically possible cause of death. It can't be something too crazy. Like, they can't, like, split into two different people and then kill each other, but it has to follow the rules of physics to some extent. But yeah, later, and he tosses the Death Note in the trash can. He wakes up, next morning he's with his girlfriend, and I'm probably missing a few events here. Also, there's this weird thing where he cooks his little sister grilled cheese, and then they make a callback to it towards the end, which I just find odd. Yeah, it's odd. But yeah, he's with his girlfriend the next morning, and they walk past a newsstand, and he sees that this guy has died of a heart attack, and he freaks out. And when he goes home, he pulls the notebook out of the trash can, catches another newscast of another criminal who's being pursued by cops, and he writes the name down and watches, and he finds out that this guy does indeed die of a heart attack. So he starts to believe. And because he sees what this thing can do, he goes to his police captain father and says, "Hey, Dad, can I look at Mom's cold case file?" And Dad says, "No, it's buried. Let's leave it alone." And this is when we get the flashback to him basically witnessing his mother getting shot to death in a botched grocery store robbery, which really just reminds me of that ridiculous shootout in the convenience store in Repo Man, where everyone just gets shot and it's like ridiculous and in slow motion. Because what happens is that this guy in a mask, I think, goes to rob the place, and then he sees Luke's mother, turns, looks away from the clerk, and then the clerk pulls a gun out and tries to shoot him. Then the guy freaks out and just starts shooting everywhere and shoots the mother along with the clerk. Basically what happened is that there was no evidence, so he was never caught. But the father says they're not going to let him look at the files, so he goes and bluffs his way into the evidence room because he sometimes goes there to pick stuff up for his father. And he opens the cold case file and starts reading it, and he sees that there was a suspect named Alejandro Lozano who got off. His father catches him there, and he says that they could never prove that it was him. So, okay, they're in the police station, and while he's there, he sees this young girl getting brought in, this teenage Asian girl getting brought in, covered in blood, and he overhears that she was she was a survivor of this home invasion, and the rest of her family was butchered, and so he sees the rap sheet for the suspects that are being pursued, and he picks it up because he sees this girl suffering, and then goes on his bike, chases the cops down who are chasing these criminals down, and he's not doing anything yet with the death note. In fact, he waits for like the police officer to be on the brink of getting shot by these guys before he does anything. And you're starting to see a pattern here, right? This is quite a big chunk of the script of just repetitive nonsense of just, he tries it on one criminal, he tries it on another, then he tries it on two more, and it's like, this thing is just padding out. If you're a fan of the comics, or the manga, or the anime, you're probably wondering, where is Ryuk, where are the Shinigami, the death gods, who each carry a death note? Well, they're not in this script. They get brought up later, but they're not used here at all. Now, this, maybe keeping them in the background is something that could potentially work, I feel, if it was actually a build up to the reveal of the Shinigami as like being a factor in this. But that's not what this script does. It hints that they exist, but then never does anything with them, and I'll get to that later. So yeah, that doesn't work. Okay, now continuing on with this storyline from where it was going. Okay, after these two guys were killed, right, the coroner looks at examines their bodies, and he discovers that they died of a heart attack, yet they had no signs of heart disease, which is very bizarre, and he tells this to Captain Murray, and that this makes this a medical anomaly. Now, Luke, who apparently is a master hacker, can hack into the police database, and he acquires the information on Lozano's known associates, who are brothers named Rick and Brett Gertzky, and he finds their address, I think it's in Yonkers, and he goes to a payphone near where they live, and he's watching them through the window, and he calls them up, and he says he's the guy who can make killers die of a mysterious heart attack. Now, these are all being reported in the press, but they're not really sure of the connection yet. And so Rick is just being a dickhead and hangs up on him. So then Luke goes, okay, I'm going to kill you, writes his name down in the notebook, and he dies. And so then he calls up Brett and starts grilling him about Lozano, because Lozano is in prison right now, but Luke wants to make sure he can prove that it's the right guy who killed his mother before he takes him down. So he grills Brett about what kind of gun Lozano used, and he makes sure that it is the right kind of gun, like a .45 Ansley, I think it's called. And he made sure he was using it at the right time. He goes like, hey, did he use it in 1997, which is when the mother died? And then Brett says, yeah, he uses it all the time I knew him, but he thinks that his girlfriend sold it off to get rid of the evidence and sold it off to a pawn shop, but he doesn't know where, and the girlfriend's name is Elsa something. And so Luke lets him live, which ends up being a mistake later on, but whatever. And okay, so Rick Gertzky also gets examined by the coroner and discovers that he died the same way as those two guys, and then checks through the records and finds the first two victims of Luke's rampage with the notebook. And then because he figures they all died in exactly the same way in exactly the same mysterious circumstances, these 4 or 5 guys, I've already lost count, that statistically they can't possibly be a coincidence. So Captain Murray opens an investigation, and he gets into contact with the FBI Special Crime Division, or whatever it's called, and their super secretive profiler named L, who only speaks to them through his handler, Wattery, and through a computer which shows the letter L on the screen. And L reveals that he has deduced that these killings are in fact targeted attacks he has deduced that these killings have to be targeted attacks based on the way they're spaced out and the fact that they're all very similar and they're all the same sort of criminal kind of guy, stuff like that. And he says that all we really need to know is how they were done. We know they were done and we know that they died. We know they died of a heart attack. We just don't know how this was performed, I think it is. And I will say this about the script's portrayal of L. I think L is a lot better than the way Luke is portrayed here, because L, you get kind of the idea of L, who is this secretive guy who eventually comes out of the shadows as part of his plan to catch this person. And the fact that he has this weird sort of gray morality where he's willing to take insane risks to make sure his goals are met. And all of that is fairly well portrayed here. The problem is that the way the script goes, we never really get to the really interesting parts of the Kira and L rivalry from the other versions, because it just goes out. Because the way the script ends, everything just goes out the door, and I'll get to that in a moment. Well, in a moment, much, much later towards the end of this episode. And this is where Luke's character really starts to kind of go downhill. Now, it was a problem to begin with, because I will say right off the bat, I think where this thing kind of starts with the characterization of Luke is an interesting spin on the material. And while there's a change to what Light Yagami was, I feel like it's a fairly reasonable idea to sort of give him this sort of psychological motivation, this revenge-based need to go out and do this, as opposed to just being bored and then going mad with power. I think it's an interesting idea. The problem is that we never really get the idea that he's even slightly unhinged or disturbed from what happened to his mother. In fact, he seems reasonably well adjusted if it wasn't for the fact that they describe his eyes as being kind of damaged or something. He has this damaged look in his eyes at one point. But he seems fairly well adjusted. He has a great relationship with his little sister, and he seems like a relatively decent guy. And so when he decides to just start slaughtering criminals en masse with this thing, it doesn't really feel like it fits with his characterization. This character, it feels like, would be interested in going after the people who killed his mother. But it doesn't really feel like he would go on this crusade. And at this point, this is where it happens, is that he just decides out of nowhere he's going to go on this crusade, and he looks up all these really well-known criminals, writes their names down, and sends an email from an encrypted Wi-Fi network near his university to the New York Times. And he signs it Kira based on seeing someone reading a manga in the library where he sends this email from, and it's like, really, that's way too self-referential and meta for this material. It's just, why? And so he sends this email into the New York Times, and they contact the police, and Marie says, don't send this out here. But of course, the rumor spreads among, the journalistic community, and so it gets out that, this guy calling himself Kira has sent this list of names that he says he's going to mysteriously kill off. And that's that. And so, he becomes sort of like an urban legend almost at this point. And so we get not quite a montage, like it's a series of individual scenes kind of cross with a montage where he's crossing out names on the list and killing them off. And in the meantime, he's checking different pawn shops for the gun that killed his mother. And L is consulted during this, and he says that these occurrences support his theory that it's a single killer, and that this killer wants the police to know why he's doing it, that he thinks he's morally in the right. And here's the thing, is that every time it will shift between Luke doing this crazy crusader stuff where he's just killing off criminals and showboating, and then tracking down his mother's killers, it feels like two different characters have just been mashed up, and it just does not work. Like I said, I feel like the dead mother thing could be an interesting starting place to get Light or Luke to become Kira, but the way this does it really just doesn't work for me. And then what it does with how he interacts with the Death Note, which is coming up fairly soon, really doesn't work. Okay, so he's checking all these pawn shops. Eventually he finds the pawn shop that had the gun at it and has to pay for the information. And he gets the information, finds out that it was Elsa who sold this gun, and the store owner says that he turned it over to the police who were going to do like a buyback thing. And so Luke basically sends like an anonymous tip about the gun to the police department where it was sent, so that he can maybe have an investigation set up. Yeah, that's eventually happens. It's so that the word can filter back to his father and they can do like an investigation about it. It's fairly convoluted. Okay, and then here is where we get a scene almost literally translated from the anime and manga, except for one element which happens here is that a man appears on TV who names himself as Lind L. Taylor. This is a weird Englishy kind of name they probably could have changed for this version. You know, it's like calling the character in the new version Light Turner, even though he's this white American kid, but whatever. And he claims to be L, and he just openly mocks and just cuts down Kira and just calls him out saying he's a coward and all these things. And then Luke writes his name down in the notebook and kills him. And what's weird about this scene is that in this version, it implies like the Death Note is manipulating his personality and changing him in some way, and that the notebook somehow drives him into a rage and causes him to kill someone who isn't a criminal, which is the and it's this running thing throughout the rest of the script where it's like the Death Note is changing him or possessing him in some way that's not really made clear what's going on. And I really don't think that works. I mean, it's something that I feel like him going crazy should be based on something that is built into himself inside his psychological makeup. Him becoming this, if you're going to tweak Light's motivations, you should make it something that is part of him, not an outside force changing him. That's just sloppy character writing and trying to take away responsibility for his actions. And I don't like that at all. And of course, it turns out that the Lindell Taylor thing was a ruse by L to sort of flush out Kira. And he says that even though the broadcast was presented as being nationwide, it was only shown in the boroughs, the 5 boroughs of New York, because he wanted to test his theory that the killer was actually in New York. And Captain Murray does not approve of L's methods because, once again, like I said, he's has a very gray morality where he's willing to sacrifice absolutely anybody to further his investigation. And after this scene, the New Jersey Police Department, where the gun was sent, they call up Captain Murray, and he agrees to get the bullet remnants out of the dead mother's cold case file so that they can perform ballistics tests. And what was I gonna say here? Luke overhears that, and of course he's happy about it. And while this is all going on, Luke is feeling these effects of the notebook more and more, and he's starting to get bags under his eyes. And of course, Sophia pops in and out of this, and she's noticing something's wrong with him, and that's really her entire role in this script up until the very end is, "Hey, Luke, are you okay?" "I'm fine." And then she doesn't say anything, which is really bizarre. And as he's feeling the effects of the notebook, he notices there's a Japanese kanji on the spine, and he sketches it, and he asks a Japanese coworker at the seaport about it, and the guy is very, very cagey about it and has to be sort of pushed into telling him. He says that it means Shinigami, and then won't say a word about it, won't elaborate. And okay, eventually, I'll just talk about this now because it's a plot cul-de-sac that goes nowhere, is that eventually Luke in this version finds the Pan-Asian Historical Center where he reads the legend of the Shinigami, where apparently a man in Japan ages ago found a Shinigami's death note and that there were consequences and stuff, and that according to legend you can relinquish it, which is also in the rules, written in the rules of the Death Note, and I believe it is in the anime, and I believe that's how the weird corporate espionage arc ended up playing out, had to do with giving up the Death Note and erasing your memories of it, which was a really cool part of that story. And yeah, I'm just gonna call bullshit on this, cause yeah, the Shinigami are death gods in Japanese mythology and folklore, but the Death Note is not part of their folklore. Another thing I forgot to mention that I have to call out as bullshit is that L says that Kira is like the angel of death or something like that in Japanese folklore. Yeah, I can call bullshit on that, because even though I'm not the most familiar with Japanese folklore, I know from watching the original anime that Kira is just the Japanese pronunciation of the English word killer, because they don't have an L sound in their language, so they have to pronounce it weirdly. The script is trying to add mythology, and it doesn't work. So yeah, that never goes anywhere. And okay, we get another, conference call with L, a Skype call without the video, basically, of him putting more clues together. And he explains to Murray and he has 2 detectives who work with him on this team as opposed to like the 4 or 5 from from the anime. And here it's Detective Gomans and Detective Washington. And they're interchangeable and don't really have any personality, which is kind of an upgrade to the Japanese live action films, because in those they had like the full roster of characters plus a gender flip, but they had none of the personality of the original characters and didn't really do that much, so reducing them. But no, he puts all these clues together, and so he can, because now that he knows that Kira is in New York, he converted all the times of death to Eastern Standard Time, and he figured out that they all occur at the same time of day, from which he deduces that Kira is on a fixed schedule and has things he can't work around. And Captain Murray points out that it sounds like the schedule of a college student. And L had already figured that out, and so they agree to start investigating different colleges around the city, even though they already know that the Kira email came from a Wi-Fi port somewhere around, a Wi-Fi hotspot somewhere around Fordham University, which is where Luke goes. But they're going to investigate all the different colleges around the city. And okay, there's a weird scene in the cafeteria at school. They're treating this like it's high school, even though it's college, which is just bizarre to me, where there's all these students sitting around, including Luke and Sophia, and they're debating the relative morality of what Kira is doing. And Luke takes Kira's side because the guy has absolutely no survival instinct or any instinct to hide. And he takes Kira's case and defends it by comparing it to the Coventry dilemma, which is a World War II thing where the British cracked the German Enigma code and found out that Coventry was the next town to be bombed. And they decided not to evacuate that because if they did that, that would tip the Germans off to the fact that the code had been broken and they would change the codes. So it was decided for the greater good to let Coventry be bombed. And it's pointless. It just feels like the writers are trying to show off that they learned about history. And I guess they're trying to use that to show off how smart Luke is supposed to be, I guess, but whatever. And now Captain Murray starts to notice that Luke is getting physically worse, a symptom of the Notebook's influence. And also they end up arguing over his mother's death, and then Murray tells him that the ballistics tests were performed on the gun and that they did not match up on the bullets. And so Luke, being pissed off, calls up Brett Gursky again and accuses him of lying. And then after some pressure, Brett says that Lozano would shove a screwdriver down the barrel of the gun to screw up the rifling, and that would mess up ballistics tests. I don't know if that's a real thing or not. Someone out there listening to this can let me know. But it sounds plausible enough, I guess, and that potentially could have thrown it off. And so this further conversation ends up pushing Brett to go to the cops and tell them what happened. And also there's this weird line here where where Brett goes like, I didn't lie, and Luke goes, yes you did, Brett, yes you did, which is like, okay, he's Sam Jackson from Pulp Fiction now. But no, Brett ends up going to the cops and telling them that he was in fact contacted by Kira and that he knew Kira killed his brother. And so that gives them, a few more clues. But then Luke goes, buys a prepaid cell phone and a calling card, then mails a calling card along with a letter to Lozano in prison. And also, this is where the Pan-Asian Historical Center thing happens, and he also notices that he's being followed by a man in a trench coat thing to happen, and then he realizes that he realizes he's being followed, and then you see him write the name of a wanted criminal in the notebook, and it cuts to him getting, I believe this was a scene from the anime as well, where he gets, in a hostage situation on a bus along with his girlfriend. And it's the wanted criminal whose name he wrote in the notebook. And it turns out this was all a setup by him, and he very specifically planned it out by how he wrote it down in the notebook to use it to flush out the trench coat man so we can figure out who he is. And he catches a glimpse of the guy's ID and figures out he's an FBI agent named Ray Rowe, as opposed to Ray Penbar, which was his name in the manga, which is kind of funny. And eventually the guy dies by running out of the bus and getting hit by a garbage truck, which is kind of funny. And so Brett Gursky gets interrogated by L, who tells him not to tell the whole story to the cops because he suspects Kira is connected to the police somehow. And then just after he leaves, Rowe enters the room, which reveals that he's connected to L through the FBI. And Luke gets a call on the prepaid phone from Alejandro Lozano. And then he basically tells him, he said in the letters that he's a lawyer who can help with his case pro bono, but he really just wanted to get the in with him and get the phone call. And so basically what it is that he starts trying to extract a confession from him by slowly taking out all the prisoners in the room around him. Now, how he could possibly know which prisoners are right there next to him and their faces and pull this off, I have no idea. But it happens, eventually he extracts a confession saying that he did in fact kill his mother in the grocery store, and then he kills him. He gives him the heart attack. And he's writing it, and he writes it on notebook pages because he knows from the rules of the Death Note he can take the pages out and they still work. So he's carrying notebook pages around with him while keeping his notebook hidden in a desk drawer, in like a secret compartment in his desk. And the death of Lozano, because he knows that Lozano is important from Gertzky's testimony, so to speak. That alerts L, who then decides he's going to place surveillance cameras in Captain Murray's house. And they get out of there just as Luke arrives, and they leave no trace except for the fact that there was a small pin that Luke left on his door hinge to make sure nobody went into his room. And it fell off, and so now that he knows they were in there, and he suspects that there are cameras, and so he doesn't get the note. And so here we get kind of a version of a sequence from the anime where he has to sort of evade the cameras and clear his name by taking care of someone while he's in front of the cameras without anyone figuring out, which had the hilarious, overdramatic inner monologue line about taking a potato chip and eating it, which I used to quote all the time, and I probably annoyed the shit out of people when I did that. But yeah, when those guys were installing the cameras, they didn't find the notebook because it was hidden, it was hidden inside the drawer, inside the compartment. And actually, it's important to point out that before he realized something was up, he felt so bad about killing Lozano and all those people together under the notebook's influence, he was planning on destroying and relinquishing the notebook, but now he can't. So yeah, that's another thing about this character I don't like, is that even on its own, I would have liked this character to at least own his actions and, own this course of action that he's taken. Instead, they do this possession thing. And so he'll do these horrible things, but then immediately try and take them back. I don't like it at all. And it's just one of the many ways in which this character is frustrating compared to the original version to me. And so L decides that he's going to reveal himself to the police now. So they meet L in person at his hotel, where he reveals his suspicion of Luke, and he explains his deductions about him in a reasonable manner, about how he fits all of the different things they know about being a college student and being near that Wi-Fi port, having the same kind of schedule, and he could easily get information from his father without knowing it, and that he's the last person they'd expect and stuff like that. And so he also tells them they had cameras installed in the house as a means of gathering evidence. And Murray gets really pissed about that and says, make sure you monitor us precisely so that you don't miss anything. And I like that about his character. I like that he was very staunch. And so while he's trying to get rid of cameras, Luke goes to a gadget store and buys a device called a camera hunter, which he sort of surreptitiously goes around his house trying to, figure out the locations of the cameras. And he has headphones plugged into it to make it look like an iPod, which just, the fact that it's a device that can spot cameras, and an iPod at the point this was written was big enough that you could fake like that. Yeah, that just dates this thing. That and the fact that they constantly reference back to the fact that Luke has a sidekick, which I'd forgotten what the hell that was. I had to look it up when I was reading this. I'm like, oh, it's the phone you slide it open and there's a full keyboard underneath, which now in the age of, the big screens on the smartphones, you don't really need it. And it's kind of obsolete. I completely forgot those existed until I read this. But yeah, so he figures out where all the cameras are, and then he clears himself. And this happened in the anime where he manages to somehow sneak a tiny TV, a notebook page, and a pen into his house, into his room in a chip bag. And so it looked like he was just studying and eating chips, but he was actually watching a broadcast and writing names down. And so that clears his name. But also, while this is going on, and then the cameras get taken out, and so wait a minute. While this is going on, Brett randomly calls Luke's house, hears his voice, and then realizes that Luke is indeed the person he talked to on the phone, and goes to L with this. And then the cameras get taken out, and then Luke, it appears, he takes the notebook, burns it, and as he burns it, he relinquishes it, which should remove all his memory of the notebook. Now, not everything is as it appears. And so after this, Brett is looking at Luke's Facebook. I keep wanting to call him Light, and sees a picture of his girlfriend Sophia on there. And then he sets up a plan with Elle that involves hacking into the university library security footage and using lie detection software on Elle's computer. And so Brett takes Sophia hostage, makes her call Luke, leading him into the library, and then threatens to kill her if he doesn't confess. And then Luke keeps going, hey, I'm not Kira. I don't know what you're talking about, because at this point he doesn't remember being Kira. And then there's this really, kind of awkwardly, crowbarred, suspense thing where the lie detection software hasn't loaded yet, and Elle's like, damn it, Watchery, damn it. Get it working. It gets working for his last denial, and it clears him. And then Brett just goes crazy, and, Sophia manages to get away, and he starts shooting, and Luke takes a bullet in the gut. And then Brett just blows his own brains out. And I believe this is kind of echoing, actually. There was a hostage situation in the first live-action Japanese movie with Light's girlfriend. I think her name was Shiori. And what was her name? Naomi Nisora, I think the character's name was. I'm completely forgetting. Yeah, but it was something that was created for that version to give it a climax. And it reminds me of that a bit. And so, yeah, Luke is officially cleared. And then we get a reveal, which is rather odd, where he wakes up in the hospital weeks later, looks over at his sidekick, which they keep mentioning this thing, and ends up playing an important role in the plot, which is just bizarre. And he finds a video message from himself on this phone where there's a lengthy confession where reminds himself that he was Kira, and he says that the hostage situation was a setup, and that he tried to burn the notebook, but it didn't work. It would not be burned. So in order to remove suspicion for himself, he used the book to set up Brett to make him and plan the details of this hostage situation step by step. And then he hid the notebook inside a gravestone, because that's one of the few places where that's one of the few things nobody would mess with, because there's societal taboos about fucking with, graves and such. And then he renounced it and lost his memories, so that because he felt like there'd still be an air of suspicion over him no matter what he did. So he had to set this thing up so that he could confess and then remove all the suspicion over himself. And then he smashes the phone on accident before he can learn where it's hidden. Because in the message, Luke is about to tell himself where the notebook is hidden, but then Luke in the present day smashes the phone out of horror and then refuses to learn where it is. And then weirdly, Elle shows up in the hospital room and is like crouching over Luke as just munching on the same flavor and brand of chips that he was eating in his room earlier, implying that he figured something out, which is just weird, that he figured out that Luke was Kira, even though the script is just about over now. And it's also weird is that it's like a redo of the very odd last scene from that first live action film, because they make a big deal out of the fact where Ryuka's just like, well, Light, how did you know that no one would eat those chips and screw up your plan? He goes like, I'm the only one in the house who eats consomme flavored chips. And then he's like, and then Elle is looking at Light across the street, and he opens up a bag of consomme flavored chips and starts dramatically munching on them and staring at them. They do that scene in this for no reason, because it goes nowhere, because Luke relinquishes the Death Note, refuses to learn where it is, and then he decides that. And as much as I don't like this plot point, I do kind of like this part where he says that he still feels bad about it, and so he decides he's going to redeem himself by becoming a lawyer and then fighting, and trying to save as many people as he possibly can in that position. And then it ends with him kind of longingly taking one last glance back at the graveyard, and that's it. That ending that really is what destroys this as a Death Note adaptation, because it basically cuts short the storyline before any of the really interesting parts happen. We never really get into any true in-depth mind games with Elle. They don't meet face to face until the second to last scene in this thing, practically. And so yeah, so it basically gets this bullshit Hollywood happy ending where Luke and Sophia get to go off and Elle has his suspicions but can't do anything. And there really is no interesting. That's the thing with this script on the whole. It's just not interesting. It's a dull thriller with some Death Note kind of scenes in it, some Death Wish kind of scenes in it, and a supernatural element that never pays off. Yeah, I can't say I like this script on the whole. And it's one of those things where if this had been a workable thriller that just had a Death Note coat of paint slapped on it, I might have been more forgiving of it. But it's not. It's just boring. It spends way too much time on Luke testing out the Death Note. His characterization is inconsistent and cheats so that he can be absolved of his sins and never have to take responsibility for anything, with that slight tag on the end of mitigating that somewhat, I'll admit. L is reasonably written, but we never get to the really interesting stuff with him. We never get to see them really face off. So what is even the point of making this as a Death Note movie? And it's not a very good script. It's not much of a Death Note adaptation. It's not much of a standalone thing. And so what happened after this was that this was written, and then Shane Black, who was a fan of the anime and the manga, signed on to direct it with Warner Brothers in 2009, I think, so not long after this was dated. And then he hated it because he didn't like the idea of there being no Shinigami, and he didn't like the whole revenge aspect of it. And so he decided to go back to a more source-accurate version for his script, or for the version he was going to direct, which would be scripted by Anthony Bagarazzi and Charles Mondry, who are collaborators of his. Bagarazzi and him, they wrote multiple versions of The Nice Guys together over like a 10-year period or something like that. And Mondry worked on they collaborated on a treatment for a Lethal Weapon 5, which I've read and is actually pretty good. Now, this version of Death Note actually isn't out there anywhere in any capacity, I don't think, or at least not that I can get it. I'd love to read it just to see what Shane Black would have done with the property, because I love me some Shane Black. I think he would have done some interesting stuff with it. But eventually he clashed with Warner Brothers over some stuff a lot, and eventually he stepped away. In fact, he was attached as late as 2013, because when Iron Man 3 came out, he said he was still working on it, but I guess he eventually just walked away. And for a while, Gus Van Sant, of all people, was signed on to direct, and I don't know what that would look like. I mean, I can only imagine it's the Gus Van Sant from Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back saying, "Think of the paycheck, Ben." That's the only thing I can think of. Or it would be like, or they would be played by like Matt Damon and Casey Affleck just wandering through a desert for ages. There would be a scene of just Luke. There'd be a scene of Light and Elle just walking through a desert straight ahead for like 7 minutes in a row or something. I don't know. But that would be weird. So eventually, Adam Wingard got signed onto it. And it was with Warner Brothers at the time. But then Warner Brothers decided they were going to make fewer films. And so they decided to let him shop it around to other places. And he got a ton of deals. And he took it to Netflix. That takes us up to where we are today. And yeah, that's really it for this Death Note episode. I know this is a shorter episode, but really I didn't want to spend much time on this script because it's really not that interesting. But yeah, that's the Death Note episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoyed it more than I enjoyed reading the script, at least. And until next time, guys, which should be a more interesting thing to read, even if it's not good. Bye.